My parents never wanted me. When I left and started my own business, they wanted to take my money and sue me for not taking care of them. And then My name's Liam, and I'm 27. To be honest, I sometimes feel like I've lived twice that, especially with the family baggage I've been hauling around for as long as I can remember. My parents, Judy and Frank, are both in their late 50s. I guess by some measures, they're considered young, energetic even. But I think they tell you differently. They've always acted as if life's dealt them the worst possible hand. And, according to them, that's largely because of me. Growing up, I didn't notice much. I mean, what kid does? You assume things are normal, that your family's little quirks are just that, quirks. But as I got older, it started to hit me that something was very wrong with the way my parents treated me. It was subtle, like a whisper you're not quite sure you heard. Then, as I entered my teens, those whispers became more obvious, and I started picking up on things I hadn't noticed before. Judy, my mom, had this way of sighing whenever I was around, a sound so loaded that it could fill a room with this crushing weight. At the time, I thought I was just annoying her by being, a teenager. But one day, I overheard a conversation between her and my dad, Frank, that hit me like a punch to the gut. I was maybe 13, hiding around the corner because I'd forgotten something in the living room and didn't want them to catch me sneaking around. I'll never forget what I heard. "I told you we weren't ready," Judy was saying, her voice sharp, laced with frustration. "If you had listened, we wouldn't be stuck with this." This was me. My dad mumbled something in response, his tone exasperated, but I didn't catch it. I didn't need to. That word, this, cut through the air like a knife. By the time I was 16, I'd pretty much internalized that I was the cause of my parents' misery. Any time they fought, they'd find a way to mention the sacrifices we made and how some people don't appreciate what they're given. I wasn't dense. I knew who those comments were aimed at. I'd get these long, intense stares from my mom, like she was trying to burn her resentment right into me. I'd try to stay out of her way, but it was impossible to avoid her altogether in a small house. Sometimes she'd stop me in the hall, look at me with that narrowed, disdainful glare, and say something like, "If only you understood how much we've done for you." The strange thing was that I felt like I was constantly trying to make them happy, even though nothing ever worked. I excelled in school, hoping they'd at least be proud of that. But my good grades and accomplishments were met with silence, or barely a grunt of acknowledgement. Once, I was actually pretty excited because I'd won a school award for academic excellence. When I told my mom, her response was just a shrug. "So what? That's what you're supposed to do," she said. I stopped sharing my successes with them after that. It got worse as I neared graduation. I'd talk about my plans, going to college, maybe studying business, trying to build something for myself. But every time I mentioned it, they'd shoot me down. "People like us don't waste money on big dreams," my dad would scoff. He said it was better for me to stick to reality and find a job after high school to help out around the house. My mom echoed him, saying college was selfish and only for kids with rich parents. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another way they were trying to control me, trying to keep me small. Despite everything, I saved up. I worked part-time at a fast food place, squirreling away what little money I made, keeping it in a shoebox under my bed. I started applying for scholarships, researching schools, and planning my escape. Because that's what it felt like, an escape. I knew deep down that if I stayed, I'd be trapped in this endless cycle of guilt and resentment, a burden they'd carry around like a chip on their shoulder forever. I was done being the reason for their misery, done hearing about how they could have had a better life if only I hadn't come along. On my 18th birthday, I took a leap. I'd been accepted into a small business program at a community college in a city 2 hours away. I hadn't told them, knowing they'd try to sabotage it. So, I packed my bags in secret, slipping out early in the morning. I left a note, just so they wouldn't think I'd vanished or something, but I kept it brief. "I'm going to college. I'll be back someday." I didn't look back as I left. I felt like if I did, I'd lose my nerve and end up trapped in that house forever. The next few years were, well, brutal. Starting from scratch with no support wasn't glamorous. My parents didn't contact me, not even to check if I was alive, which in a strange way was a relief. It was as if the freedom I dreamed of my entire life had finally arrived, even if it was tinged with loneliness and a lot of ramen noodles for dinner. My apartment was a shoebox, and my furniture was mostly stuff I'd found on the curb. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I had control, and that was worth every penny I didn't have. The business idea I'd been nurturing since I was a kid began to take shape in college. It started small, a side hustle fixing up websites and creating simple apps. At first, I barely made enough to pay for groceries, but over time, as my skills grew and word spread, I found a small but steady stream of clients. By the time I graduated, I had a portfolio I was proud of and a vision for a company I knew could work. I went full-time with my business, putting everything I had into making it succeed. Around the same time, I noticed things started changing in me. I felt more resilient, more confident, and I was finally able to push aside the years of resentment and hurt. I realized that building something from scratch, without anyone's help, especially not my parents, had healed me in a way I hadn't thought possible. Years passed, and my business grew. By the time I was 27, I had a small team, a modest office, and a reputation in the industry that kept clients coming back. Things were stable, maybe even comfortable, and for the first time, I felt a strange, quiet sense of pride in what I'd accomplished. It wasn't the kind of pride that needed validation from anyone else. It was the pride that came from knowing I'd done it all on my own. Then, one afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text notification that made my stomach twist. It was my mom. After nearly a decade of silence, she reached out as if nothing had happened, opening with a simple, "Hi, Liam. How have you been?" The sudden message was surreal. I sat there staring at my phone, my fingers frozen, unsure how to respond. Did she actually care? Or was this just another attempt to rope me back in? My gut said not to trust it, but my heart, well, part of me still craved a real connection, still wanted some proof that, deep down, they might actually care. I replied, keeping it casual. "Hey, Mom. I'm doing well. How about you?" The response came faster than I expected. "We heard you've been very successful with your business. So proud of you." There it was. After years of silence, she was interested in my success. Not me, just my success. When I first left home at 18, I felt unstoppable, free, and ready to conquer the world. But reality hit fast. College was a blur of classes, part-time gigs, and constant worry about how I'd pay my next bill. My one-bedroom apartment was so tiny I could make a full circuit from the bed to the kitchen to the bathroom without taking more than 5 steps. I'd furnished it with whatever I could find for free, which was mostly a mismatched collection of things other people had thrown out. Ramen and canned soup were my dietary staples, and I could barely afford a coffee, let alone the vision I'd had in my head of what being independent would look like. But despite the cramped living and cheap food, I knew what I was working toward. Every late-night coding session, every struggle, it all felt like a step toward freedom. My own freedom, a life I could finally shape without anyone's interference. I taught myself as much as I could, absorbing information from online tutorials, forums, and textbooks. I was determined to master every aspect of building a business from the ground up, though I was still naive about what that actually entailed. I started small, trying to make extra cash fixing up websites for local businesses or offering freelance coding services. Every dollar I earned felt like proof that I could make it on my own. But it wasn't long before I hit my first real hurdle. A guy named Derek, an acquaintance from college who said he had connections in the tech industry, reached out to me, offering what sounded like an exciting opportunity. He had a vision for a partnership. My skills combined with his sales savvy, I was too eager to question his vague promises and too green to recognize that I should have vetted him more carefully. Derek's smooth talk and confidence were convincing enough that I didn't notice he was just using me to get free work. Over 6 months, I poured every spare hour into our joint venture, developing a website and creating software solutions that he swore would revolutionize our client base. But the clients never came, and eventually, neither did Derek. He ghosted me, taking the product I'd built and cutting off all contact. It was an expensive and painful lesson. After that, I became a lot more cautious about who I trusted. I tightened my operations, became more meticulous about contracts, and stopped working for free. I learned that being independent also meant being fiercely protective of my work. But those years were lonely. I watched as friends from college went on to stable jobs, nice apartments, and even relationships. Meanwhile, I was still coding into the early hours of the morning, living off the cheapest food I could find, and rarely socializing outside my work. Then came Emily, my first serious relationship since moving out. We met through a friend of a friend, and for a while, it seemed like everything was finally coming together. She was patient with my odd hours and supportive of my dreams, even if my tech startup was still a modest side hustle at best. But as time wore on, the demands of my work and my financial instability took a toll on us. Date nights became rare, and my stress started affecting her too. One night, after a particularly brutal argument about my obsession with work, she broke things off, saying she couldn't handle the instability. Emily's departure was a wake-up call. For a while, I questioned whether my ambitions were worth the price of losing people who cared about me. But every time I considered giving up, a deeper part of me resisted. This was my dream, my one shot at a life free from dependency or manipulation. So, I threw myself even harder into my work, letting the heartbreak and isolation fuel my determination to succeed. At 24, I finally landed a major client. Clearwave Tech, a company I'd cold emailed hundreds of times, finally responded. They were looking for a streamlined software solution to improve their operations, and they were interested in hiring me to develop it. The deal was far bigger than anything I'd taken on before. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and, most of all, a chance to prove to myself and everyone else that I could do this. I spent the next 6 months working around the clock, pouring everything I had into building exactly what they needed. It paid off. Clearwave Tech was so impressed with the product that they signed a multi-year contract with me, providing the first real source of stable income I'd ever had. That contract wasn't just money. It was validation that I was doing something right. With that project under my belt, I started getting more clients. The work came in faster than I'd anticipated, and soon, I had enough revenue to move out of my shoebox apartment and even hire a couple of interns. By the time I turned 25, my business was solid. It wasn't huge, but it was growing steadily, and for the first time in my life, I had financial security. The thrill of independence was real, and I finally felt that I was truly out of the shadow of my parents. I didn't think about them much. After years of silence, they were more like ghosts than family, a distant memory I'd learned to live without. That is, until one random Tuesday afternoon, when I got a text from my mom, Judy. Seeing her name pop up on my phone screen was surreal. For years, I hadn't heard a single word from either of them, not even on birthdays or holidays. And now, suddenly, out of nowhere, my mother was reaching out, and her message was painfully casual, as if no time had passed at all. "Hi, Liam. How have you been?" she wrote. "We heard you've been very successful with your business. So proud of you." It was like a punch to the gut. She had never been proud of me, not once. Not during my years of straight A's, my graduation, my hard-fought victories in building my business from scratch. Now, out of nowhere, she was reaching out, congratulating me on something she'd spent my entire life dismissing as nonsense and impractical dreams. Part of me wanted to ignore the message, to erase it and move on. But there was still that lingering, pathetic hope. A part of me that wanted to believe she was reaching out because she'd changed. Maybe, just maybe, this was her way of mending the past. Against my better judgment, I responded, "Hey, Mom. I'm doing well. Thanks for the message." Her response came almost instantly. "That's wonderful to hear, Liam. Your father and I are so proud of you. We always knew you'd make it." Always knew? That was rich, coming from the woman who once told me I'd never amount to anything unless I stopped living in the clouds. Still, I bit back the urge to respond with sarcasm. I told myself to let it go, to take the high road. Maybe this was just a small attempt on her part to reach out, to acknowledge my success. I could leave it at that. Then she added, "We were actually thinking we could meet up sometime. Maybe have a nice family dinner and catch up on things?" I stared at that message for a while. The idea of sitting down for a family dinner felt absurd. I couldn't remember a single pleasant family meal from my childhood, and I doubted anything had changed. But the suggestion lingered, making me wonder if maybe, just maybe, they were extending an olive branch. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet up. It was a mix of curiosity, hope, and, if I'm honest, loneliness that made me say yes. Despite the years of resentment, part of me still wanted that connection, still craved some kind of validation from them. Maybe we could finally put the past behind us. So, I texted her back. Sure, let's meet up. Judy responded with excitement, and within minutes, we'd set a date in place. I was on edge about it, but maybe this was finally a turning point. After all, I'd changed, matured, and fought my way to independence. Maybe they had, too. Our family reunion dinner was set for a Saturday evening at a nice restaurant in town. When I arrived, I immediately spotted my parents seated at a table near the back, dressed up and looking surprisingly put together. I felt a mixture of anticipation and unease, but I brushed it off, determined to make the best of this meeting. Maybe they really did want to reconnect. Maybe this was their way of reaching out, just as they'd said. They both stood when I approached, and my mom gave me a stiff, slightly awkward hug. My dad reached out a hand, and I shook it, surprised by how formal it felt. There was a moment of silence as we all sat down, each of us taking stock of the others. I tried to relax, even cracking a few jokes, and for a little while, things actually felt nice. We ordered our food, and I started talking about the business, describing how hard it had been at first and the journey I'd gone through to get where I was. But I soon noticed something strange. While I was speaking, they weren't really listening. My dad kept glancing around the room, and my mom's responses felt superficial, as if she was just going through the motions. Then, just as the main course arrived, they exchanged a quick look, and my mom cleared her throat, leaning forward. Liam, she began, your father and I, well, we're incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. Truly, you've built yourself quite a life. I nodded, feeling both relieved and cautious. Thanks, Mom. That means a lot. She glanced at my dad again before continuing. And now that you're so successful, we were hoping you could help us out. You know, as family. A sense of foreboding settled over me. Help you out? I echoed. My dad jumped in, his tone unnaturally casual. Things have been a bit tight for us recently, Liam. We've had some unexpected expenses, and honestly, with the way the economy is right now, well, you know how it is. I didn't know what to say. Part of me had been expecting this, yet I still felt blindsided. I'd been hoping they were proud of me, that this meeting was their way of showing they cared. Now, I realized they weren't here to reconnect. They were here because they saw me as an opportunity, a solution to their problems. My mom gave a dramatic sigh. Your father and I have sacrificed so much for you, Liam. Raising you wasn't easy. You have no idea the lengths we went to, making sure you had everything you needed. I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to remind them of the cold, dismissive attitude they'd had my entire life. I wanted to snap, what sacrifices? But I held back, still clinging to the fragile hope that maybe helping them would bring us closer. How much are we talking about? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. They glanced at each other again, their faces lighting up just a little, as if they'd passed some test. Well, my dad began. We're a bit behind on the mortgage, and there are some medical bills we've been struggling with. He rattled off a few numbers, the total coming to an amount that made my heart drop. It wasn't something I couldn't afford, but it wasn't exactly pocket change either. Despite the sinking feeling in my stomach, I nodded, trying to be gracious. Okay, I can help you with that. Relief flooded their faces, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Maybe this was the start of a real relationship, a way to finally connect with them. But that sense of connection was short-lived. Over the next few months, I started getting more and more requests for a little help. At first, I brushed it off as genuine need. They asked for money here and there for small things, grocery bills, utility payments, car repairs. But then the requests became more frequent, and the amounts grew. I found myself writing checks and sending transfers regularly, with my parents always offering reasons that tugged at the same old strings of guilt. We did everything for you, Liam, my mom would say, her voice heavy with reproach. We sacrificed so much to give you the life you have now. All we're asking is a little help in return. And every time, I'd nod. agreeing to their requests even though I knew something felt wrong. I told myself I was being a good son, that this was my duty as family. But as the months wore on, I began to feel like they were less interested in reconnecting with me and more interested in what I could do for them. One night, after transferring another substantial sum for an urgent medical bill, I called my best friend Aiden to vent. Aiden had been my sounding board for years, the one person who'd seen me through the tough times and knew how much I'd struggled to build my business. "They're bleeding me dry, man," I told him, frustration simmering in my voice. "Every week it's something else. I feel like they're using me." Aiden didn't mince words. "Dude, they're using you. You don't owe them anything, especially not after how they treated you growing up. They're taking advantage of you, plain and simple." I knew he was right, but I couldn't shake the guilt. "Yeah, but they're my parents. They did raise me, even if things were rough. Doesn't that count for something?" Aiden was silent for a moment before replying. "Only if they're actually trying to be there for you, too. If they're just taking from you without giving anything back, that's not family, Liam. That's exploitation." His words stuck with me. I started paying closer attention to how my parents interacted with me, and the patterns became painfully clear. They'd only call or text when they needed money. There were no friendly conversations, no questions about how I was doing or how my life was going. Every interaction revolved around their financial woes, and my role was clearly defined. I was the solution to those problems. Finally, I decided to cut back. I called them up and explained that while I wanted to help, I couldn't keep covering their expenses indefinitely. I'd be happy to assist with genuine emergencies, but I couldn't keep supporting them on a regular basis. The response was immediate and vicious. My mom's voice turned cold, her tone sharp with anger. "After everything we did for you, you're turning your back on us? This is how you repay your family?" My dad chimed in, his voice full of bitterness. "We put our lives on hold for you, Liam. We sacrificed our dreams, our happiness, just so you could live comfortably, and now you're too selfish to help." The guilt came flooding back, crashing over me in waves. I found myself faltering, even apologizing, trying to explain that I wasn't abandoning them. I just couldn't keep up with their constant demands. But it was like talking to a wall. They didn't want to hear my side. They only cared about the money. For weeks, I felt torn apart. I went back and forth, wondering if I was being heartless or if they were manipulating me. I spent sleepless nights thinking about all the sacrifices they'd supposedly made, wondering if I owed them something, if this was my duty as their son. But every time I sent them another check, the sense of obligation felt heavier, like chains tightening around me, pulling me deeper into a trap. The pressure began to show. My work suffered, my stress level skyrocketed, and I started withdrawing from friends and colleagues. Even Aiden noticed, calling me out one day when I canceled plans for the third time in a row. "Look, man, I know you're going through a lot," he said gently, "but you need to step back and think about yourself here. You've given them enough. If they're just using you, there's no amount of money that'll ever be enough." I wanted to believe him, but the guilt still weighed heavily on me. I kept telling myself that maybe, just maybe, if I helped them long enough, we'd finally have the family bond I'd always wanted. But each time I tried to pull back, the guilt tripping and emotional manipulation only intensified, leaving me wondering if I'd ever be able to break free from their grip. I remember the exact moment it all came crashing down. After months of feeling torn between guilt and frustration, I'd finally reached my breaking point. The last request for money had been absurd. An amount so large it felt like they were testing me, pushing to see just how much I'd give before I pushed back. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing that this couldn't go on. I'd spent years feeling used and manipulated, holding onto a hope that one day they'd see me as more than just their personal ATM. But I finally understood it wasn't going to happen. The next morning, I called my mom and told her that I couldn't keep financially supporting them. I kept my tone firm, explaining that I was more than willing to help in real emergencies, but the constant demands had to stop. Predictably, her reaction was icy. She didn't yell. She was too smart for that. But her voice turned cold, the warmth replaced by a steely bitterness. "Well, that's disappointing, Liam," she said. "We always thought family meant more to you. I guess we were wrong." My dad's voice echoed in the background, muttering something along the lines of, ungrateful, followed by a litany of their usual complaints about how they'd given everything for me and deserved some respect and appreciation. But this time, I didn't waver. I kept my cool, reiterated my boundaries, and ended the call. For a few days, there was silence. It felt like a strange victory, a hollow one, maybe, but a victory nonetheless. I thought that maybe, just maybe, they'd finally back off. But it turned out I'd barely scratched the surface of their plans. A week later, I received a certified letter in the mail. Seeing the official envelope with my name on it, I felt a knot form in my stomach. I opened it, and as I read, my heart dropped. It was from a lawyer representing my parents. The letter demanded that I provide substantial monthly support payment to them, effective immediately. They were citing a little-known state law requiring adult children to provide for their aging parents, framing it as my legal obligation to take care of them. I read it 3 times, the words blurring together as shock and anger flooded through me. I could hardly believe it. They weren't just asking for money anymore. They were trying to make it a legal obligation. My parents were threatening to sue me, their own son, to force me into financially supporting them. I felt my chest tighten, my hands trembling as I reread the letter, trying to make sense of how they could do this to me. I called them immediately, my voice shaking with a mix of rage and hurt. Mom, Dad, what is this? Are you seriously trying to sue me? My mother's voice was calm, almost too calm, like she'd been waiting for this call. Liam, we're just doing what's fair. You have so much, and we're struggling. We're your parents. We raised you, gave you everything we could, and now it's your turn to give back. But a lawsuit? This is insane. Do you have any idea what you're asking? She sighed, her tone infuriatingly patronizing. It's the law, Liam. You're our son, and as our son, it's your responsibility to help us. We've done so much for you. This isn't about money. It's about fairness. Fairness. The word echoed in my mind, twisting into something bitter and wrong. I couldn't believe they were using the law to try and force me into this, twisting the definition of family to suit their own needs. I'd spent years trying to earn their approval, hoping to build some kind of genuine relationship. But here they were, seeing me as nothing more than a retirement plan, a resource they could tap into without any regard for my feelings or my life. Over the next few days, I spiraled into anger, disbelief, and a profound sense of betrayal. The legal jargon in the letter kept replaying in my mind, each word reinforcing the reality that my parents were fully prepared to drag me into a courtroom if it meant getting what they wanted. I knew I needed to act fast, so I started researching, trying to understand the law they were citing and if there was any way to fight this. As I read, I discovered that they'd been disturbingly meticulous in their planning. The law they were referencing did indeed exist, but it was rarely enforced and typically only applied in cases where the parents were completely destitute and incapable of providing for themselves. Yet, here they were, twisting it to make it sound like I had no choice but to comply. They'd found a loophole and were exploiting it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't some desperate last-ditch effort. No, it felt calculated, as if they'd planned this all along, waiting for the moment when they could wield it over me like a weapon. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. They'd never cared about me as a person, only as a means to an end, and now they were trying to trap me in that role for the rest of their lives. I felt sick, like I was drowning in a betrayal so deep I couldn't see the way out. I confided in Aiden, who was as shocked as I was. Man, they're insane, he said, shaking his head. This isn't just manipulative, it's downright evil. You can't let them get away with this. He was right. But part of me still struggled, trapped between a sense of obligation and the crushing weight of their betrayal. Despite everything they'd done, they were still my parents, and I felt this nagging voice in the back of my mind whispering that maybe I owed them something. Maybe I was being heartless. But then, as if fate wanted to drive the point home, I found a box of old photos in my closet while searching for some documents for my lawyer. The photos were from my childhood, and as I looked through them, memories of all the times they belittled and dismissed me came flooding back. I remembered every snide remark, every cold glance, every reminder that I was an unwanted burden. I'd spent years convincing myself that I could somehow earn their love, that if I just did enough, gave enough, they'd finally see me as their son. But these photos were a stark reminder that they'd never truly cared for me, not as a person, anyway. Armed with that clarity, I started building my case. I met with a lawyer, explaining everything that had happened, and we began piecing together evidence of their manipulation and the financial support I'd already provided over the years. It wasn't just about fighting the lawsuit anymore. It was about standing up for myself, for the life I'd built, and for my right to be more than just their financial safety net. The betrayal stung, but the anger and determination gave me a strange sense of focus. I was done letting them dictate my life, done bending to their will out of guilt and obligation. For the first time, I felt like I was truly breaking free from the chains they'd wrapped around me since childhood. A few weeks later, I received another letter, this time from their lawyer again, laying out the terms of their support demands in precise, painful detail. They wanted a substantial monthly payment, enough to cover all their living expenses, medical bills, and more. I read it over with a grim sense of satisfaction, knowing that I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to be their puppet anymore. As I prepared to face them in court, I realized that this battle was more than just a legal fight. It was a chance to finally put the past to rest, to reclaim my life from the people who tried to control it from the moment I was born. It hurt like hell to know that I'd never have the family I'd always hoped for, but I was ready to fight for the freedom I'd worked so hard to achieve. This time, I was going to stand my ground, and I knew, no matter what the outcome, that I'd never again let them take control of my life. The decision to fight my parents in court wasn't easy, but once I made it, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I knew that I couldn't let them win, not just because of the money, but because of what it represented. This was my chance to take back the control they tried to steal from me, to prove that they couldn't manipulate me anymore. As my lawyer and I prepared our case, we dug deep, combing through every interaction, every manipulative demand, every twisted statement they'd used to guilt-trip me over the years. I shared all the details with her, and as she listened, I could see her shock and growing determination to help me break free from their hold. Then, in a surprising twist, help came from an unexpected source. I'd reached out to a few old family friends, not really expecting much. But as word got around about what my parents were trying to do, people started coming forward with stories of their own. Former neighbors, a family friend, even one of my mom's old co-workers, all shared experiences of Judy and Frank's ruthless, manipulative tactics. I heard tales of unpaid loans, schemes to guilt others into helping them, and a long history of deceit. It turned out that I wasn't the first person they tried to use for their own benefit, though I might have been their most elaborate target. One story in particular stood out. Our former neighbor, Ms. Duncan, a kind elderly woman who had lived next door to us when I was a kid. She reached out, offering to testify on my behalf. She told me about times she'd seen them ignore me when I was younger, leaving me alone for hours or even days, and how my parents had borrowed money from her on multiple occasions, never repaying a cent. She said she'd always wanted to help me but felt powerless. I was touched, and for the first time, I felt that maybe justice was within reach. The day of the trial was tense, but I walked into that courtroom with my head held high, fortified by the strength of my supporters and the mountain of evidence my lawyer had compiled. My parents sat across from me, each wearing expressions of feigned innocence, as if they were the victims in all of this. I felt a pang of sadness seeing them there, but the anger and betrayal quickly overrode it. This was about finally standing up for myself, and I wasn't about to let their lies distort the truth. The trial was intense. My lawyer presented our case in clear, brutal detail, laying out every instance of manipulation, every demand for money, and every attempt to twist the law to suit their needs. When Ms. Duncan and the other witnesses took the stand, they didn't hold back. The stories they shared painted a picture of two people who had a history of exploiting those around them, revealing the depth of my parents' manipulation and deceit. The courtroom was silent, tense, and I could see the discomfort in my parents' expressions as the truth of their actions came to light. When it was their turn to defend themselves, my parents played up the sacrifices they'd made for me, spinning tales of hardship and selflessness. But by then, The jury had heard enough. Their version of events felt hollow, exposed for the lies they were. After what felt like an eternity, the judge made the ruling. In a decisive tone, she dismissed their claim, stating there was no legal obligation for me to support them. She went further, admonishing them for attempting to manipulate their own son for financial gain. As her words echoed in the courtroom, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a release so profound I could hardly believe it was real. When we left the courtroom, my parents didn't look at me. Their faces were set in hardened expressions of resentment, but I didn't care. I knew I'd made the right choice. As they walked out in silence, I finally understood that I didn't need their approval, their acceptance, or their twisted version of family. I was free. The days following the trial were surreal. I spent them in a strange mix of relief and quiet reflection, realizing that I'd finally broken the last chain tying me to my painful past. For so long, I'd felt trapped by my parents' expectations and manipulations. But now, standing on the other side of it all, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I was free to live my life on my own terms, to build relationships that were genuine, to find people who valued me for who I was, not what I could give them. And for the first time, I felt a deep sense of pride, not in what I'd achieved financially, but in who I'd become. This battle had tested me in ways I never expected, but I'd come out stronger, more resilient, and ready to build a life without the shadow of my parents' control. I was ready to move forward, free to shape my own path, without any strings attached.